And yet, unfortunately, today's Democrats have made, I think, a really cynical political decision that voter fraud, they believe, helps elect more Democrats, and so the more fraud, the better. What this bill does is decreases the ability of Congress to address instances of fraud when it occurs, and I believe Congress has a responsibility to do that. I would note that in the election of 1876, when there were serious allegations of voter fraud, Congress did not throw its hands in the air and say there's nothing we can do about it. No, Congress appointed what it called an election commission that consisted of 5 senators, 5 House members, 5 Supreme Court justices that examined the facts and evidence of voter fraud and made a determination. That incident became the predicate for what is now the Electoral Count Act. That was responding responsibly. What this bill is trying to do is take Congress out of the business of trying to correct fraud. Now, as I said, I understand why Democrats are supporting this bill. What I don't understand is why Republicans are. In the House version, Lofgren-Cheney, it did ostensibly get 9 Republican votes, all from Republicans who are either not running for re-election or who were beaten in their primaries. In other words, not a single Republican who actually is going before the voters is willing to support it. I don't believe senators from this side of the aisle should be supporting a bill that enhances the federalization of elections and reduces the ability of Congress to respond to the very serious problem of voter fraud. I think this bill does that, and so I intend to oppose it.
That was Ted Cruz announcing his opposition to reforms to the Electoral Count Act, a position that's clearly so unpopular, not a single solitary member of his own party sided with him. When you're the only senator in a party that still overwhelmingly voted against convicting Trump for inciting an insurrection on January 6th, the only one, then congratulations, you are as extreme as it gets. Now, Ted Cruz decides to try and claim that reforming the Electoral Count Act is some Democratic ploy to help them commit voter fraud. Which, I'm sorry, but what? The Electoral Count Act is being reformed so that there's no ambiguity in terms of what roles are perfunctory, so that, for example, John Eastman doesn't get his way and allow the vice president to unilaterally decide whether or not to transmit electors that determine the fate of his or her own re-election. It also raises the threshold for the number of senators and lawmakers who are needed to sustain an objection to a certain state. If there truly is fraud, then that bar will be met. But if there's no fraud, and it's clearly just a naked ploy to install the loser of the election as the winner, which quite literally just happened thanks to the very efforts of people like Ted Cruz, then that threshold won't be met, and rightly so. And yet Ted Cruz is so aggressively, shamelessly full of shit that he's trying to play this thing off as if it's license for Democrats to commit fraud, which is nothing more than the last grasps of the big lie. The only difference is that he's saying it in a room where even his own Republican colleagues tacitly acknowledge that he's full of it by simply ignoring him and voting for the legislation anyway. And to be clear, ignoring Ted Cruz generally is the right course of action. He then goes on to invoke the election of 1876 as the predicate for the Electoral Count Act and even says, quote, "There were serious allegations of voter fraud." But right there, he gives the game away, because what happened this time in 2020 included no serious allegations of voter fraud, but rather a concerted effort by a nakedly corrupt political party to all come together to pretend that there was fraud and then use that lie as a predicate to overturn the election results to help their candidate in Donald Trump, meaning that Ted Cruz undermines his own already tenuous argument. And look, not that I need to rehash this BS, but if there was fraud, don't you think Republicans would have been able to, I don't know, prove a single instance of it? Don't you think they'd have won even a single case in court alleging fraud out of the more than 60 cases? Don't you think that they'd have come up with a shred of evidence? Don't you think, if there was fraud, that the Democrats would have actually won the Senate outright by a bigger margin than just 50-50? Don't you think they would have expanded their House majority instead of watching it contract? And why didn't all those Republicans who won their races renounce the results? Why didn't those winners demand a redo if their ballots were as tainted as they're claiming it is? Why didn't Republicans flip seats on the same ballot that Trump won? If a single Republican can come up with an answer to any one of these questions, I'd love to hear it. But if not, then you probably realize how much of a partisan hack Ted Cruz sounds like by continuing to peddle these outright lies. What's especially bizarre is that Cruz tries to undermine the legitimacy of the 9 Republicans in the House who voted for their version of this bill by saying that all 9 were either beaten in a primary or aren't running for re-election. And so those people apparently don't count. But here's the thing, the reason those people lost or are leaving office is because the litmus test issue on the right is the willingness to lie about the election results. Trump intervened in every single primary to ensure that he can install a lackey who would be willing to parrot his bullshit lies about election theft. So the fact that those 9 Republicans are leaving Congress doesn't mean their votes shouldn't count now, but rather they should be a wake-up call to voters out there that to exist in the Republican Party these days, you have to be willing to embrace a lie. So yeah, not exactly the home run point that Ted Cruz thinks it is. And finally, Ted Cruz virtue signals about just how serious voter fraud is, which is ironic because that same guy has yet to introduce a single piece of evidence proving any semblance of widespread voter fraud. In fact, even in the smattering of individual cases of voter fraud, usually just a handful of cases in each state, and certainly not enough to make even a fraction of a dent in the results, those people almost always end up being Republicans. Like a registered Republican in the Villages in Florida who voted in person in that state while casting an absentee ballot in a different state. Or this guy in Pennsylvania who cast an absentee ballot in support of Trump for his mother who died over a decade ago. Or a Republican official in Ohio who admitted to forging his dead father's signature on an absentee ballot. Or a Colorado man who pleaded guilty to voting for Trump on behalf of his missing and presumed dead wife. Or a Nevada Republican man who aired a sob story about someone casting a ballot for his late wife before later admitting that that someone was actually him, a crime to which he pleaded guilty. I could go on, but I think you get the point, because lest you forget, every accusation is a confession. Now, Ted Cruz's antics aside, here's how the actual voting actually went.
The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Feinstein.
Aye.
Senator Schumer. Senator Warner.
Aye.
Senator Leahy. Aye. Senator King.
Aye.
Senator Merkley. Senator Padilla.
Aye.
Senator Ossoff.
Aye.
Senator Blunt.
Votes aye.
Senator McConnell.
Aye.
Senator Shelby.
Aye.
Senator Cruz.
No.
Senator Capito.
Aye.
Senator Wicker.
Aye.
Senator Fisher.
Aye.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Aye.
Senator Haggerty. Chairwoman Klobuchar.
Aye. I also want to note, when you finish, I'll let the clerk finish for the 2 members who couldn't be here.
The ayes are 14, and the noes are 1.
Very good. And although they could not be here, I have proxies for Senators Merkley and Schumer. And for the information of the committee, this is how our committee rules work, they have asked me to announce that they would have voted aye.
I mean, even Mitch McConnell voted for the reform. But before you lionize the Senate Minority Leader, here he is using the opportunity during a vote to reform a bill that was only necessary because his party tried to overthrow a free and fair election to actually attack Democrats.
The chaos that came to a head on January 6th of last year strongly suggests that we find careful ways to clarify and streamline the process. And so does what happened actually in January of 2001, January of 2005, and January of 2017. For more than 20 years now, every time voters pick a Republican president, we've seen at least some Democrats in Congress resist the people's decision and try to challenge the electoral count.
Yes, Democrats have objected to certifications in the past. The difference? They didn't try to get the vice president to unilaterally declare their candidate the winner. They didn't try to send false slates of electors, and oh right, they didn't stage an insurrection where they attempted to assassinate those officials who stood in their way. Just, you know, for starters. So the fact that this reform looks poised to pass is absolutely, unequivocally, and objectively good news. But let's not forget that the vast majority of Republicans, and nearly all Republican candidates, will continue to advocate for overturning any election where their side's candidate doesn't win. So while the passage of this legislation is sorely needed, the broader goal here is this: make sure that Republicans do not hold power in this country, and certainly don't validate their strategy of nominating people who won't accept any election results where the Republican doesn't win. Now is the time for a repudiation at the ballot box unlike ever before. Not just so that we can achieve our legislative priorities like codifying Roe, but also to send a message to Republicans that election denialism is a losing strategy, and that they better drop it altogether or be prepared to be locked out of power for the foreseeable future. Before you go, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. You can click the thumbnail right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work even further, the best way is to subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. There you can check out my interviews with major players in the world of politics, including President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Katie Porter, Jamie Raskin, and so many more. Plus other interviews that live exclusively on the podcast. That link is also right here on this screen, or just search No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen wherever you listen to podcasts.